Does leaving religion make you a less moral person, or perhaps is it just the opposite? Welcome back to another episode of Faith Unraveled. Today, we're going to be getting into the topic of morality. What happens to people that have directed their lives from this very specific moral system of their religion when they leave? And is it possible to navigate with a new moral code, or do we lose our moral system altogether? We're going to get into it. We obviously have very specific opinions around this topic.
Can you describe what was your moral value system in the church, the key pillars within the church that you felt like you had to follow?
As an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, my moral system had a lot to do with what my church taught me was good and bad. And when I look at those things now, I actually consider a lot of them arbitrary. And I'll give you an example: drinking tea and coffee. In fact, if you look at a lot of studies from a health perspective, there are certain teas that are actually beneficial for our health. But from a moral perspective, coming from an active Latter-day Saint, that would be considered immoral to partake of something like green tea. And that's because we have been taught that we're not to do that it's a commandment from God to not drink green tea. So breaking that would be a disobedience, an act of disobedience, and disobedience is inherently immoral from a Mormon perspective.
What about wearing garments? Is there a morality piece to wearing garments?
Absolutely. There was for me. When I was given my garments, I was told to wear them night and day. And in my mind, to be most morally upright, I would be a person that wore my garment as instructed. That was something that I had covenanted to God.
What about activity in the church?
Absolutely. Anything that was associated with a temple question or something that was commanded by God, which isn't just the 10 commandments for Mormons. The commandments have to do with the word of wisdom, anything that has been directed by a modern prophet. So even when President Hinckley asked us to take out our second piercings if we had them and wear just one earring in each ear, that to me was a moral standing. I'm following the prophet. That is a moral thing to do.
Tattoos would follow that too, right?
Absolutely. Anything instructed in the Strength of Youth manual that tells our youth how to speak, not using profane language, that would be a matter of morality. Not masturbating, that would certainly be an immoral activity.
Not having sex before marriage, of course.
Sex out of wedlock, immodest dress.
Impure thoughts.
Yep. Okay, now what about you? Are there any others that you can think of?
Now, as I've left the church, I don't like the idea of what sanctity is, because it's all defined by some man in a church that followed some type of patriarchal system. So when I left the church, it took me a few years to figure this out. But basically, you hear all these voices telling you, how are you going to have morality? What's going to keep you from harming other people? What's going to keep you from having affairs? Somebody just wrote on one of our patriarchy deconstruction videos, he's just cheating on you because now you guys have nothing to live by. And in reality, our entire moral code now, after leaving the church, is all around just not harming other people. I don't necessarily believe that the church puts rules into place for people's betterment.
Right.
I think they put rules in place to keep them under control, whether it's the members itself keeping them deficient to some level so that they can provide some type of solution for them in the world. And that's the only solution you can go to. So you're dependent upon them for that Band-Aid or that resolution to whatever you're deficient in.
Right. When you really start to deconstruct from a coffee tea perspective, you realize really truly how arbitrary most of the LDS commandments are. The commandments that are specific to Mormonism. And they were the ones that you mentioned when you talked about like modesty and wearing the garment. And it kind of reminds me of if you have this parent with these very specific rules about their house, and it's like, you've got to stomp your feet 3 times before you walk into my house. If you don't do that, I am upset with you. I am offended. And everyone else is looking at you going, why do you do that? And you're like, well, I want to live a moral life by doing what my parent tells me to do. But everybody's looking at you going, but that doesn't have anything to do with goodness. And I think that is the case for most of the moral codes within Mormonism. They really are arbitrary just for the sake of being obedient to that parent.
So here's another one I would ask you and how you felt about this is women working in the workspace or women staying at home.
Right.
Was that a moral code or was that an option you felt?
Growing up during the time that I grew up, I definitely thought that it was a moral high ground to be a stay-at-home mom. And that if you're going to do any kind of work, it needs to be within the home. And or even if you're going to do any kind of like breadwinning. It should come from being in the home, because that's what we're trained to do. I mean, that's what our young women's manuals really had us focus on as young girls. It's in the family proclamation that like the women's place is in their home. So yeah, that's absolutely, we really start to break it down. There are a lot of guidelines and standards within the church that are designated as morally correct. But in reality, they're just really, I think, like you said, for control.
Yeah. And there's a lot of judgment and shame that goes around it if you do not follow those guidelines and standards. An example is when I was a kid, there's a lot of beach activities. So we lived in California. We lived right next to the beach, and we would go to the beach on a regular basis during the summers for activities. And it was very clear that women could not wear bikinis going to the beach. And there was times where if you did, you'd have to either put on a shirt or some other activity or some other thing to cover yourself up so you're not tempting the guys around there. It's the value system that comes out after you leave Mormonism is you take all those guidelines and standards and see that they're not of God, that they're produced arbitrary or made up for control within the church. Now you have to step back and look at the value, and the value is a lot of people come to is like harm. They don't want to harm people. And so that becomes like their single most important thing, which aligns with what she brought forward with.
Exactly. Now, the sanctity and purity topic, I'd like to talk about that as it relates to things like Prop 8, when actually what the church is telling us is correct and moral is actually harming other people. Like when you look at Prop 8 and how the church is asking members of the church to vote so that marriage will not be extended to anyone except a man and a woman. So gay people can't be married. So they're doing this in the name of morality, but this was so harmful. The church's construct around LGBTQ people is monumentally bad, and it's done in the name of God. This is what our parent figure wants us to do, a straight cisgender hetero life.
Yeah. Yeah. And where we're at in life, there is not a standard or a guideline driven by God today.
Right.
And so
it's just us.
It's just
as far as any of our,
that we know.
We hope that maybe there's something beautiful and loving guiding our lives. But the idea that it's like this parent with all these very rigid rules is just not in our paradigm anymore.
So then we see it as very harmful. And that person in that system that feels that shame and then feels like they'll never have peace and love in their life. And we've seen this suicidal ideation that has come around that because of that, that moral system that the church has put on them is now very harmful to who they are and where they're going, which we see as very arbitrary now.
Absolutely. And that's definitely a contribution to that uptick in suicidal ideation that we saw after the 2015 church policy, which made it impossible for children of LGBT people to get baptized, for children of gay people to serve missions, and very harmful all around, and was stamped with morality. This is what we're going to call a moral standard. And from our perspective now, it's just the opposite of that, because it's actually harming people. And if it is just us, then really the only moral system that we should have is to do goodness to others and to not harm people.
Yeah. If I was to go into another one, sex before marriage, and the harm that comes with sex before marriage, because God doesn't want you to have sex. At least that's the way that the church has prescribed it. We call it the law of chastity, where you shall not have sex outside of marriage. And so you're now stuck following a system in the church, and you're not exploring your sexuality. You're normally getting married the first time you meet someone and feel attracted to that person, because you don't want to sin,
right?
Even though everything in your body's telling you otherwise.
Yeah.
Right?
So what you're saying is that we're actually harming our young people by not allowing them to explore sexually before they tie the knot with someone and decide to have a family with someone. How many people are getting married to someone that they're not compatible with? Maybe
because they just want to have sex with them, right?
Because they're just at the point in their human development that they're ready to start having sex, and you got to get married to do that. I also wanted...
So that's the reason why for those who are not members who are wondering, like, why do Mormons get married at such a young age? That's the core.
Yeah, and it's true for Christianity a lot too. Mm-hmm. I will say though, I want to go back to what you were talking about with the pool parties and the beach parties in Southern California. I actually know someone who was in the Relief Society presidency, and they were having a pool party at her house. And she was asked by the president to please ask one of the sisters to go home and change because the swimsuit that she was wearing was not appropriate for the priesthood holders that they had at their activity. Now, I want to stop and think about this for a second. So the point of morality that the church has assigned to bathing suits is that they should cover your midriff. And that and
for women.
For women.
Not for men. Right. We don't wear shirts.
Right.
We wear just our trunks. Right. So it's a double standard, right? You would say.
Totally. That's a great point. Thanks for throwing that in there. Now I want you to think about something for a second. Let's compare the impacts of Brother Smith seeing Sister Jones in a bikini. And then let's compare the harm of that scenario to the harm of Sister Jones being sent home by her Relief Society leaders because she was not dressed the way that they wanted her to be dressed. Like, think about that juxtaposition just for a second. I could not have seen this as an active member of the church, but the way that I look at it now is that when you get so many arbitrary points of what we're going to call morality standards, we get confusion about what is actually good and what is actually wrong. And when I break this down, it just makes me think about how many people in the church I have seen disciplined for sex out of marriage. I've seen returned missionaries excommunicated or disfellowshipped because they have had sex with a girl after their mission, after they've been endowed. And I just have to juxtapose that to the people that I have seen disciplined for child sex abuse who had the same consequences.
Yeah.
Think about that for a second. Someone who has harmed a child, in my book, what is the worst of the worst. And the church is issuing the same kind of disciplinary measure as they would to consenting adults just because they had sex out of wedlock. And I think that's atrocious. And I think it's naturally what happens when you have a system with a parent who's telling you to stomp your feet 3 times before coming into the house. Otherwise, you're an immoral person. It is completely ridiculous. It's instituted by the church for probably just control. And obedience is important in a high demand system. And I think it's very easy for members of the church to lose sight of actually what's right and wrong. Because really, when you boil it down, the question that you need to ask yourself is this harming someone?
I was just thinking back to Joseph Smith and his relationship with Fanny Alger and having sex with Fanny Alger in a barn and Emma not knowing about it. I was going to say, is that any different?
It's a great point, because what later happened when Joseph Smith had pursued these relationships with multiple young women, and eventually he got to Nancy Rigdon, who turned him down. And he actually talked to her not just about plurality, but concubinage, like having a concubine and how this is something that God wants for his prophets. And she said no. So he went and he dictated the happiness letter.
He pretty much slut-shamed her too in the paper at the time, the Nauvoo paper that they had.
How much do you know about the happiness letter?
Pretty well, pretty good.
So what is your interpretation of what was said in the happiness letter? And I want to preface this, though, by just giving a couple clips, because you've probably, if you don't know what the happiness letter is, you've probably heard it. So here's a little clip of what that sounds like.
Happiness, my brothers and sisters, is the object and the design of our existence.
The prophet Joseph Smith said, "Happiness is the object and design of our existence."
The prophet Joseph Smith taught us, happiness is the object and design of our existence.
The prophet Joseph Smith said, "Happiness is the object and design of our existence."
The prophet Joseph Smith taught, happiness is the object and design of our existence.
So it sounds really beautiful when you hear these leaders talk about happiness as the object and design of our existence over the pulpit. But let's talk about what the happiness letter...
What was the intent of that letter? That intent of that letter was to tell Nancy that, hey, it's okay that a prophet can break the laws of God as long as he's been told that he can break the laws of God. And so he was telling Nancy that, hey, I'm allowed to have sex without Emma knowing about it. You can be my concubine and we can hook up all you want because God has allowed me to do that because I'm the prophet.
And doesn't he also talk about how what's right in the eyes of the world may not be right in the eyes of God? Look at all of the things that happen in the Old Testament.
That was the point. Like, the world because it wasn't dictated from God that that's adultery. Because for me, I'm the prophet and I've been told that I can have as many wives as I want. It's okay.
Yeah, I get to say what is right and what is wrong. And I think that this initial letter from the prophet Joseph Smith extends even until today. We look to our prophet, or as Dallin H. Oaks just said over the general pulpit, sometimes there are even temporary commandments. There might be times that we ask you to do something just for a time. And so the members of the church are just looking to the leaders to see, what's right? What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? And there is inherently a sense of morality by being obedient to the church, being obedient to the prophets, because it's the same as being obedient to God.
So the point I'm making is they didn't even follow their own morality code.
Right.
They had exceptions to break that morality code
right.
at that point in time. And so if there is truly a God, and that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, like, how would it change over time, and why would it matter? And
right.
But for the church has evolved and changes all the time, just as like the garments have now started to change to allow women to wear tank tops. But I would say that moral code has changed over time based upon like what Joseph Smith did.
Yeah, I feel like my sense of morality has become more refined since leaving the church because I've sifted out all the junk.
Well, and this might be the reason why. Like I was thinking about one of the morality code is going to church, right? Like going to church every week is something that we've been instructed
commanded to do.
So it's a standard, and if you don't, then like most of the members will know you'll be labeled as less active.
You can't have a temple recommend if you're not active.
These morality codes is an on and off button. It becomes binary. And then what I've seen with church members is they're very binary in the way they think about this. Oh, he's drinking coffee. He's probably not an active member of the church. Oh, he's not wearing his garments. Oh, this guy is probably not as active in the church. And so you get this binary mindset. The evolution outside of the church is no longer binary. It's not on and off. It's this now gray area of nuance that comes into play. Into, for us, like drinking coffee, not a big deal. Drinking alcohol, not a big deal. Having sex before marriage doesn't harm anyone. Matter of fact, it helps their sexuality and them learning who they are, not a big deal. And so that's the evolution that happens with ex-Mormons as they start leaving the church.
The other thing that becomes really pertinent is that you get to define your own journey. You may not feel good dropping profanities. You may not feel good drinking alcohol. That's totally your call. Each of us get to define what happens to ourselves. And if you're a parent, you can establish rules for the family. Like if I find out that one of my kids is like decided that they're just not going to do any of their homework, like they're going to have, I'm going to have a discussion with them because I feel like their life is going to have more potential if they work hard. And there are definitely areas that we can focus on to try to excel, to become better, or to give ourselves more opportunity. But for that to be something that defines like what kind of person you are you a good person or a bad person or an immoral person? Certainly for me, what it boils down to is how we treat other people.
Yeah, we've had conversations about good and bad too. Like there is good and bad behavior, but is there really good and bad person? I don't know that.
I'm of the belief that people aren't like good guys and bad guys, that we're all capable of good things. And I think we're all capable of bad things. And when we really boil it down, I think that the primary focus should be how we treat other people. And I do think that it is super paradoxical that was really the message of Jesus, was just forget all this legalistic behavior. Let's just focus on the new law to love one another and to do unto others as you would have done unto you. And somehow his church has evolved into something that looks much different than that. Lots of rules, lots of legalistic focus. And I think it's interesting. I think
Very
it's interesting.
Similar to the Sadducees and the Pharisees.
I think you could say
of old, right?
Do you feel like you are less? Do you feel like you still have moralities since leaving more religion?
Yeah, it's funny because you'll get into the comments and you'll see these comments all the time where, hey, you've left. They've gone off the deep end. They're now drinking alcohol. They're now doing whatever, having sex with everybody out there. But no, you still develop your own value system based upon where you currently are today. And it's easy when you've always been taught since, primary age that anybody that follows outside the church is sinning, they automatically label that person as bad. And so they automatically assume any ex-Mormon that leaves is most likely wanting to sin and want to be bad. Right. It's no longer, there's no nuance. It's all on or off, so bad or good.
Right. And you were saying earlier, like sex out of marriage, totally fine. Alcohol, totally fine. I think that for me, I think for me, it's an individual choice. Like for us, if one of us were to have sex outside of our marriage, that would be very hurtful to the other person because we have decided that we are a monogamous relationship. Now, if we decided that we were both okay with bringing other people in or having an open relationship, that to me is not inherently immoral because you're not harming the person that you're married to.
And you're consenting, right?
It's about consent.
Both partners are consenting
Honesty,
to that environment.
Consent, right?
It's
exactly.
like alcohol. Like we're consenting to be able to drink alcohol. Is alcohol good? You could probably argue that it's not good for your body.
Right, but it's not immoral.
It's not immoral, right? And so drinking something that might be not good for your body, I could probably say some of the food that we eat that we buy in the grocery store is probably not good for our body also. So,
right.
So it's a nuance.
Yeah.
I think that's the main thing that happens with ex-Mormons that leave the church. They get rid of the binary good and bad, and they go more into a nuance, and they normally land in the harm. If I'm not harming anybody, what does it matter?
Right.
Like, why should I dictate to that person?
Well, and you could argue too that leading a very promiscuous life could harm people. Like if you're not making them aware of all the other people you're having sex with, if you're leading people on and making them think that you're more committed than you are just because you like to have casual sex with lots of people. I mean, I think there's lots of different important discussions that could happen around this. These are the kinds of discussions that I think are really important to have in the home with your kids, talking about, is your behavior helping other people? Is your behavior potentially harming other people? If your kid's talking in class and the teacher's getting frustrated and she's calling home saying your kid's being super interruptive and rude and it's taking time away from the class, that's a good opportunity to sit down with the kids and say, okay, how is your behavior impacting other people? Same goes for if you are drinking so much that you are not your best as a parent for your kids. I mean, I think there's lots of extensions of this. I don't think, like you said, it's not so black and white. It's not the alcohol that is inherently bad. It's not having sex out of wedlock that's inherently bad. Let's look at the other potential impacts.
That goes with that, right?
Right. There can be, it can harm. It can be, it can maybe lead you to not be your best as a parent. So I think that having these kinds of more nuanced conversations are important.
Can I ask, like, how do you now share your value system to your children? Like, we have 3 children, right? And the way that we raise our kids before the faith crisis to now, like what's the difference, would you say?
Right. Well, I would say it definitely comes up with these individual topics. So I use the example of the teacher and whether or not speaking out in class, out of turn and taking the time away from the teacher and the rest of the class, that's an opportunity to talk about like how our behavior can affect other people. We've had a lot of discussion on like rated R movies in our house because we have one child who's an adult now that loves film, and we were super conscientious about the movies that he watched before. But now it's not a matter of the rated R movie being inherently bad. It's more about whether or not that's an appropriate movie for their cognitive development, whether they're old enough to see something like
disturbing.
That.
Like
right.
I took my 4-year-old son to Lord of the Rings, and he didn't sleep for like a whole month.
Yeah.
And that was
probably not the best on our part.
I don't even know if it was rated R. I don't think it was rated R.
No, I would definitely not have let you take our son to rated R movie.
But what I'm saying is, like, that wasn't cognitively, and this is while I was in the church.
Right.
That I was following the church standards.
Yeah.
I couldn't, like, I wasn't taking him to rated R movie, but I was taking him to a movie that totally disrupted him.
Well, you could say the same for soda. There's nothing in the church guidelines that says like, hey, you shouldn't be stopping at Sodalicious every afternoon. We're telling you not to drink coffee, but you're fine with Red Bulls and Rock Stars. But the kinds of conversations that I would have with our kids are just like, how do you feel? Like, is that something you want to do again? Is it good for you? Does it help your body? Does it hurt your body? Is it a fun food? Is it like, it's a much more nuanced conversation. And sometimes raising kids with nuance is a little more difficult because they might make mistakes. When you've got the fear of God in you, you're going to be more inclined to stay on the straight and narrow path. But I would also argue that sometimes making mistakes is good for kids.
So talking about the deconstruction, I was scared when we first left the church on how to raise our kids outside of no structure whatsoever. And I felt like that was one of the reasons why I tried to stay in the church as long as possible before realizing I just couldn't. Like, my mental health was going down because I was going on a weekly basis on something I didn't believe.
Yeah.
And so as I have stepped away, I have found like it's not that hard conversation. More importantly now is I'm having authentic conversations with them, asking them, okay, what do you think about this? How do how do you feel now? The way we taught here and now we're teaching this, is it, how does that resonate with you? I think we've had better conversations on building what that structure is now than we had in the church and just letting the church kind of do it for us. Right?
Well, to that point, I think when I deconstructed, one thing that I had to realize is that all of our parenting up till now has been around this right and wrong paradigm.
Binary.
And now the right and wrong really just boils down to, as we've mentioned several times, whether or not it hurts other people. If something hurts other people, I would say that is inherently wrong. I think that voting for Prop 8 was inherently wrong. Now, what I've moved into now as a parent is having more discussions on what we value as people or as a family. And this is a very different kind of conversation, because when you look at the things that you could potentially value, you can get into things like comedy, creativity,
dancing,
entertainment, dancing. Do you value humor? Do you value promptness? In our family, we have, I think, just accidentally made it a value system that you're on time for places. When you go places, you get there on time. You don't bail on appointments. It's not moral, though. It's just, it's a value system. But you could argue that it's not moral to be late all the time and waste people's time, because
there's a harm to that.
Yeah, are you potentially wasting people's time?
But the outcome of that is those people might not want to hang out with them anymore if they're late.
Consequences. That's a great thing to discuss with kids after deconstruction, is like the consequences of our actions. And are our actions giving us opportunity, or are they robbing us of opportunity?
That's the type of conversations we have now, is like, what happens? Like, we had this conversation with school, like, you're late to school. What happens? Well, you get a tardy. What happens after a certain amount of tardies? You have to walk them through the consequence. Or, oh, you're late to football. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to be running, or you're going to make your whole entire team run if you're late to football. So, like, it's about conversations now of the situation itself and the consequence of that situation, and how it harms either him or the people around him, around that. And so I like I said, I think we have more deeper conversations instead of saying, okay, here's the guidelines in the Strength of Youth pamphlet, just don't break them. And if you break them, you're in big trouble, and you're going to have to go to the bishop and repent of this. Now it's more like, hey, what's the consequence of your actions? If you do it, guess what's going to happen? We're going to tell you, we're not going to like hold a hard line on this, but if this does happen at some point in time, you will like lose friends, you'll like lose your opportunities.
Right.
Yeah. Like, he's an ASB. If he doesn't do certain things for ASB, next year he might not have an opportunity to be an ASB anymore.
Right.
So
right.
Those are the consequences now.
Exactly. And sometimes having consequences in the natural real world is good. And that's why we as parents can stand by when our kids have made mistakes, even if they have done something that's morally incorrect. Maybe they've hurt someone's feelings. Maybe they've used it's so interesting. I was just talking to a member of the church about a guy calling his kid a pussy. Okay. And I was talking about how deeply misogynistic I thought that was. And the response of this person that I was talking to, who's a member of the church, is he said, "Oh, that's so crude. That's such a crude word to use." And I just had this amazing juxtaposition, because I realized I would have thought that was bad to say because it was crude as well, just a few years ago. And now the reason that I think that calling a kid a pussy is because it is deeply misogynistic. It's making the child feel like their hesitation or their fear was a bad thing. Comparing them to a girl as an insult is deeply misogynistic. I mean, there's something so much deeper than just using the word pussy. And it's just interesting how this perspective really changes, that like using the words that we use against people, it's not about the crudeness of the word. It's because of the message that you're communicating.
Yeah.
So, ultimately, I think from stepping away from the church, what I realize now is that having all these arbitrary rules, not drinking coffee, not drinking tea, covering your shoulders, wearing a garment down to your knee, that really just clutter our vision, and they really just cloud reality.
I'd almost say that they pull you from living a life experience, because now you're just following a bunch of guidelines. You're not thinking through like every decision you're making and figuring out what's the consequence or the value you get out of that decision. You're just walking through life.
Absolutely. It keeps you from it keeps you from thinking deeply because you're so concerned with all these things. Luna Lindsay wrote down a list of like all the requirements from home teaching and visiting. I know it's called ministering now, to temple attendance, reading scriptures, attending your bishopric meetings, your class presidency meetings. I mean, I could not believe how long this was. Indexing, family history, like all the temple projects, all the things that are considered assignments and not just projects. And when you really look at this and you go, this is what I have to do to like be a good servant of the Lord. And you're just on this hamster wheel that you can't even slow down to look at what is really working for your life. Right? What's really
because I feel like you get in that hamster wheel and that hamster wheel just keeps on moving.
It's like,
and
why?
You don't step out and smell the roses. You don't meditate. There's a lot of things in life that you're not doing because you're just like going through that system.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything else you want to add to our episode today?
Nope, I don't.
Please tell us in the comments if you think that your life is more or less moral with or without the church. If you're an active member of the church, please don't hesitate to comment here. I love getting feedback from active members. As always, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're listening on podcast, we'd love for you to leave us a review. And of course, we are Faith Unraveled on Instagram, and I do check my DMs. So send episode ideas there and feel free to reach out. And thanks so much for joining us today.
I don't check those DMs. She does.
I check the DMs. I do. Yes, I do. And I do have a little bit of sweaty pits today. So if you're watching on video, you got to see that firsthand. How embarrassing. Have a great day, you guys. See you later.